Yes, thank you, Mary. And as you might have noticed, Mary spoke without a microphone. That is because she was not online. So when we get to the Q&A afterwards, it's very important that everyone in the audience, when you speak, you have to wait for the microphone, unless those online will not hear anything. So that's for the practicalities. Welcome, all of you, to day 2. And a thank you to all of you who attended the reception at the City Hall yesterday. I think that was wonderful. I talked to the mayor. She was very pleased to have us there. And as a doctor herself and as a former ombudsman for children in Norway, she was very pleased that we, as editors, put mis and disinformation on the agenda also internationally. So thank you for that. I'm sure you also all agree that Nicolene van der Linden's keynote yesterday set the stage for these next 2 days in a wonderful way. So we will continue with doing just that with just as impressive keynote today. I know that because I've heard Camilla Stoltenberg a range of times. She is the CEO, that's what it's called, at the Independent Research Institute of NORCE. She's the professor at the Department of Global Public Health and Primary Care at the University of Bergen. She's a medical doctor and holds a Ph.D. in epidemiology. But for most Norwegians, I think Camilla Stoltenberg is most known as the former Director General at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. And this is because she was the Institute's kind of main public spokesperson and scientific advisor to the Norwegian government during the COVID-19 pandemics. And I think, and I'm sure most Norwegians agree, that as such, she stood firmly for scientific openness, and also she stood firmly about what we did not know about the pandemic at the different stages, and as such, she inspired trust in science. And that is a role Camilla Stoltenberg has taken before, because 20 years ago, this year, she was crucial in uncovering Norway's largest research scandal, when she discovered that one of the research articles written by the Norwegian Jon Sudbø and published in The Lancet really was an academic fraud. Her numerous national and international assignments are far too many to mention here, but in this community, I have to mention that she is also a member of the editorial advisory board of Lancet Public Health. And in 2022, she was named the 10th most powerful woman in Norway. So it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce to you all Camilla Stoltenberg.
So good morning to all of you who are here, and good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, and even good night to those who are listening and looking on the internet through Zoom. And thank you for inviting me to come here. It's a pleasure and very exciting for me to meet all of you. You are part of my former life, because I used to be Director General at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, and public health was at the core of almost everything I did from the early 1990s to 2023. When I had to decide what to do next, I thought I will continue to do what I do feel passionate about, is to show leadership in science and science communication. I did not want to become a leader at hospitals or parts of the health system, but rather someone who has a possibility to look broadly at science. And I'm very happy with that. So now I'm at an institute that covers both climate, environment, energy and technology, and health and society as our scientific fields, and that does just science. not all the other things that we had to do at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, particularly as leaders. So what I'm going to do now is to tell you a relatively chronological story about not all the misinformation that is around today and that has been around for many years in different forms, but rather how I and my colleagues and all the people that I've been working with in different contexts have been trying to counteract misinformation, to make science more open or as open as possible, and also to communicate openly about what we know, what we don't know, what is uncertain, what we may be able to know, and what we will never know, because we will never know exactly what's going to happen tomorrow or 10 years from now on, but that is part of science, to try to envisage that through forecasting and through scenarios and through communication about that as an instrument for explaining why science is uncertain. Scientific uncertainty doesn't mean that we are uncertain ourselves, because we may be relatively certain about how uncertain science is. But it is hard for many others to understand this, as long as scientific institutions, people who do science, have had some holy position where everything they say is true because they are scientists, and where we do not inspect ourselves the way we do inspect others, and where we do not require the same kind of independence and openness from others that we do from ourselves. So to start this story, I will begin with not this very building, but the former building that was the home of the Norwegian Medical Association. Now, I was elected into their first Committee on Human Rights in 1991. And for 10 years, I was part of that Committee on Human Rights. And we worked with medical associations, and some of them had committees on human rights, but most didn't, in areas of conflict. We did, for example, work in former Yugoslavia during the war from 1993 to 1991. We visited many times. Their medical associations visited us, and we tried to keep up a conversation, a dialogue about what they should and could collaborate on. But it turned out to be very hard. One of the things that made it very hard was that their relationships with their own authorities and their changing authorities, the unpredictability and the crisis, meant that we never knew whether they were under pressure from their own authorities or whether they were actually speaking their own opinion. So I got very engaged in how to try to maintain independence for those medical associations at the time. But then I moved on to the Institute of Public Health and became director of epidemiology, and now and then I had to take over for our director general. One of those occasions was when SARS-1 broke out in China, or rather, not when it broke out, but when it got known to the world. And it turned out that it had actually broken out 6 months prior to the time when it spread to other countries and became a threat for the world that everybody else became aware of. So what had happened in the meantime? In the meantime, this is a very long story and I'm not going to tell it all. It was kept locally, regionally, and then nationally as a secret that there was such an outbreak. And the WHO and the Norwegian authorities, we were shocked that it wasn't an obligation to communicate immediately, not when you are certain that it will spread or when it has already spread to other countries, but immediately when there is a risk for that happening. And I got engaged in thinking about how can we secure the independence of national public health institutes or their equivalents in other countries and in our own country. Because I then realized that we didn't have that independence secured in our own country either. And in my opinion, we still don't. Although there are mechanisms in place in Norway that makes it very difficult for any government or parliament to stop communicating from the Institute of Public Health about what's going on, because we have free media, because there is openness in society, and because that will certainly not be a legitimate reason for firing the director, for example. But it is not secured legally, not yet at least. So I was then elected into the IAMPHI, the International Association of National Public Health Institutes, and I realized that this was the case in all countries. No country, not only China, but no country had acts, had a regulatory mechanism securing the independence of the institutes that were reporting on outbreaks of infectious diseases. So, in fact, they could all be stopped or delayed by authorities who were anxious for good reasons about the consequences for the economy if it was mentioned at all that it might become an outbreak. So what does one do in such a situation? The outbreak, the SARS-1 outbreak was in 2003, 2004, and I came into IAMPHI a few years later and started speaking about the importance of having independence from the government, of having that preferably as a legally regulatory issue in the act that governs the public health functions or the public health institutes. And it turned out that for many of those institutes that were part of the International Association of Public Health Institutes, there were more than 100 at that time already, that was not a concept they were familiar with at all. They simply did not, they had never thought about the necessity of that. I'm not blaming anyone for that either, because it hadn't been an issue that was discussed. But then, in 2008, as many of you may remember, we had the financial crisis. And what happened in the wake of the financial crisis? Well, then governments were told by the IMF, the International, Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, that unless they had a code of practice for statistics on the economy of the country, that made it completely clear that the statistical agencies, the national statistical agencies, were both well-staffed with highly qualified personnel, with good knowledge of science, scientific competence that was competitive internationally, and that they had sufficient resources and were obliged to report, regardless of what their governments wanted them to say about the economic development. They were not eligible for loans internationally. So that was because of the shock that it turned out that Greece, for example, had been reporting wrongly, falsely about their economic development. And this changed the whole game for statistical agencies. There had been such a code of practice in place before, but it wasn't as strict as it is now. And then to go a little bit back in time, in 2002, the European Food Safety Agency, EFSA, was established. And that was established after several food crises that reduced the trust in the food system in European countries and across Europe severely, because There wasn't information about the origin of meat. There was the Creutzfeldt-Jacobs outbreak in the UK and several other very hard to deal with crises in the food system. And then that particular topic, risk assessment and science, in order to support the food system, became the focus of how do we do independent research, but still funded by governments and independent of commercial interests, but free from the pressures of governments who want them to conclude in certain ways. There may be difficulties around this because what's it called? The regulatory measures are so strict that it may be hard to find scientists who are sufficiently independent themselves from, for example, commercial interests in order to do that science. But at least it is a very advanced system that has been developed for that particular field, the food system. And it seems to me that having looked at this food system crisis in Europe, having looked at the financial crisis and the SARS-1 outbreak, when there is a crisis, then people realize how incredibly important it is to have independent institutions and independent scientists and have openness about what's happening and what we know and what we don't know. But it doesn't seem that it becomes a general issue, because I think this pertains to many different issues, not only those that have been subject to major crises that are known to the public. So why haven't we got in place after the COVID-19 pandemic a system where there are regulatory international and national requirements for public health institutes, for example? Well, after I had been working on this for many, many years through my different positions in IAMPHI, together with others, and more people were engaged. When I had left, then it happened. So it was a good thing that I left. And in 2024, in December, the IAMPHI organization decided on promoting a code of practice for public health functions and public health institutes, inspired by the one for statistics, but more broad in the sense that it's not only for statistics, it's also for scientific results, etc. And I think that's a good step forward, but it hasn't been implemented, as far as I know, in any country, although I haven't really checked. So there may be countries where they have started working on this, but I haven't seen that it's happened in Norway. So what does one do when you aren't secured the kind of independence that you need? Well, one of the important things you do is to communicate about it. Because once it's communicated to media, not only to special media that you represent, but generally to everyone, it's much harder to fire, for example, the leader of the organization without being heavily criticized from media, or not to be free to speak the truth. But this is a continuous dilemma, and it's not something that can be solved by regulatory measures forever, so you have to work on it continuously. So what did we do at the Institute of Public Health? Well, we had guidelines or principles, I'll just have to find them, for how to work both in crisis and in normal or more normal times. It doesn't seem to me that we ever return to anything normal, but I hope we will sometime. Long before, prior to the pandemic, the COVID-19 outbreak, we had the following guiding principles I say we, although I'm not there any longer, but I was there at that time. Those were that employees are encouraged to participate in public debate. They don't have to ask for permission, but we are happy at the Institute, or we were happy at the Institute, to know when they planned to do it, but it wouldn't be sanctioned if they did so without telling, and it wouldn't be sanctioned if they had opinions that were different from what the leadership had meant, or if they had opinions on issues where we did not have an opinion or a qualified opinion. So we also encouraged open and understandable communication to all, to the whole population, to all different groups, and transparency about working processes, methods, professional discussions and disagreements, and funding. And that should be the rules during regular times as well as in crisis. That is very different from what the recommendations, for example, from the WHO. Now, I must admit that I haven't checked what they say now, but the ones they had in place when the pandemic broke out 5 years ago, were not only the WHO, so they're not special, but most governments, most authorities say that when there is a crisis, all leaders should stand together and have the same opinion. Well, that's what Norway did when the swine flu broke out in 2009, 2010. And what happened was that there were discussions between the Director General at the Health Directorate in Norway and the Director General at the Public Health Institute and the Minister of Health. Every day they went public on media, they had press conferences, and they expressed one single opinion, no disagreement. So what happened then? Well, the media started digging into this, investigating, and asking people to find out what did they actually discuss in the back room? What were the disagreements? And that created a lot of distrust because it came out as scandals that they had been disagreeing. It came out as revelations, something secret that people were not meant to know, and that were that would undermine the authority of these three institutions and these three leaders. But what we said when the COVID pandemic broke out was that unless we show that we had discussions in the back room, or that we have those discussions openly, people will simply not believe us. Because under such uncertainty, what do you need? Well, you need discussions. You also need a mechanism for making decisions and for implementing and for respecting those decisions. But unless you have those discussions, how can those decisions be any good? Particularly when uncertainty is huge and when the situation may change so rapidly that you have another opinion 2 days later than the one that you expressed as the single one and only opinion that one could have a few days back. So how can you prepare the population for not only trusting you once when the crisis breaks out, but to continue to trust you when they see that we must change our opinion, that there are disagreements and there are different options. And we said to the others, the Ministry of Health, and in this case, the whole government went on stage as part of the management of the crisis during the COVID pandemic. And we said, we will continue to follow the guidelines and principles that we have developed for normal times. Please let us do so. And originally they were shocked, and I think they felt that their only option, this is speculation, just to make that clear, that their only option was to keep us at a distance and to marginalize us, Public Health Institute. But that lasted only for a day or so. Then they tried to convince us to agree with the others. And we said, well, we are willing to have those discussions to find out whether we can agree. But if we don't, we will continue to say what our opinion is, but we will also continue to respect the fact that it is the government that makes the decisions. And we will continue to make it clear what the different roles are between those major actors during the management of the crisis. And that, over a few months, it was first very difficult, but then I don't know exactly what happened, and I think I should ask at some point the former Prime Minister, Erna Solberg, what was it that happened? Because on the 7th of May, there was a lockdown in Norway on the 12th of March, 2020, but on the 7th of May, we were on direct TV debating. She pointed at me and she said that we had had a recommendation where we said that we doubted that it would be wise to continue to close down schools and kindergartens. And there were many reasons for that. But one reason was that we said that our experience, but there's no science, we said, but our experience is that that may mean that particularly those that are teenagers or older, they will start behaving in ways when they're not in school, where you can have regulatory measures to keep a distance, etc., and where there is some structure. So if they're at home and the spring, this time of the year, they will be outdoors, they will be together, they will be close to each other, so they will start behaving in ways that may spread the virus more efficiently than if they are in school. And she was very angry and said that I had no science supporting this. And I said, well, that's true. We've said all the time that we want more science on what's happening, and it's been very hard to build that at this stage. And they even tried to stop us from saying this because they said it was undermining the measures. But then a few weeks later, she was interviewed and she said that, well, she wasn't certain that it was right to close down for so long the schools and the kindergartens. And from then on, it became much easier to communicate the uncertainty, the alternative ways of thinking. And that happened not in the back room, it happened on stage openly. I'm not saying that being so open and speaking about how little we know, because we knew very little about how these measures worked, is easy or always recommendable. I think if the threat is different, if there's a military threat, for example, you have an enemy that wants to hurt you, it's much harder. So then other rules may be the right ones. And there is a risk that it may be confusing, that you may lose trust. But the way we did it, we actually maintained trust throughout. And we did the same thing for vaccines. We said, we recommend them, but there will be side effects. We will monitor them from day to day, and we will immediately communicate if there is a probable or established side effect, and we will correct our or adjust our recommendations according to that. And that turned out to create a very high degree of trust, not only in the authorities, but in vaccination, not only in COVID vaccination, but in all vaccinations. We thought it might be undermining the vaccination program, and we were very eager not to let it do so, but we were so extremely open about this that it was only Denmark that did a similar thing. We don't know of any other countries who did so. And that meant that we were, during those times, we were monitoring trust every week, and we could see that we were able to maintain trust through several crises where side effects of the, or adverse effects of the vaccines had been published, but where we had also immediately been able to detect them because our surveillance systems were much better. This was a field where science really worked during the crisis, and we were able to adjust our recommendations according to them and see that the adverse effects that we had identified dropped immediately. And I think that there's never been a period, at least in Norway, where science came more close to people. You could meet people around everywhere. In taxis, for example, there weren't that many other places where I was permitted to meet people I didn't know from before, that were extremely knowledgeable, not only about viruses or the coronavirus in particular, but also about vaccines and about science. And lastly, about mathematical modeling and about the RO and how infections spread, because we were communicating all this from the scene every day. I'm not saying that we reached out to the total population, but my experience was that when it's important for people, there's no limit to how much they are able to understand and how good questions they are able to pose. So today, there is a huge crisis in trust in science and in showing the value of science. I think that we should continue to show the importance of science for everyone in society in much better ways than we have been doing. I think we've done it relatively well in Norway during the pandemic, but we're not doing it well enough when there's no crisis. So exactly how we shall do that, I don't know. I mean, I know no good things that we can do, and I think we've become much better at communicating science in the sense that many scientists are good at standing up, telling about their discovery, the thing that specific study they've done, but how science influences a whole field, a whole crisis management, a whole societal development, a whole industry that is going to grow rather than stagnate. That is not equally well communicated. So I think we need to think about how can we make science that is important for everybody, regardless of whether it's basic science with a very long-term perspective, where it's not clear whether it will become useful or not, or science that is directed more directly towards solving societal issues or global issues that we all are confronted with today. But I do know that science and innovation is a major key to both solving the issues that we are confronted with and to creating trust if we are able to create it, use it, and communicate it in the best ways. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing these experiences and thoughts with us and showing us, I think, amply that openness in science is so important for hindering mis and disinformation by inspiring trust within the public. Now we open for questions, answers, and no, not answers. Well,
yeah,
might be some answers too, but questions and comments. There's one in the back over there.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Eva Grabari-Chandanovsky, is Vice President. I really liked the points that you were telling us during your speech, but I was wondering, what do you think about the role of social networks? Because it seems that today the most debate was run at social networks, and for example, during COVID and especially after vaccination has started in Croatia, there were some scientists from the medical field or biomedical field that they actually use social networks for disseminating, I would say, wrong information or their point of view, which is not aligned with the medical point, you know, like a standard medical point of view. And I think we are often neglecting this way of communication, especially if you're, you know, working as a researcher. Sometimes I see that some researchers find these channels not appropriate for a proper scientist. But usually, as we can see, usually most of the debates are run on social networks, and I would say common public absorbs this type of information. So what do you think? Can we perhaps adapt to this new environment?
The short answer is we must use social media because that's where the communication happens. And there are huge groups in society that you will never reach until you start using social media. So you have to find out what social media to use and for what purposes. You have to get to know them. And the Public Health Institute in Norway actually did that, not only during the pandemic, it started before, but it escalated enormously during the pandemic. And it was, I would say, apart from the daily press conferences, the main mechanism of reaching people. And that was also, as you mentioned, the place where most of the discussions around vaccination happened. And we were working continuously on responding to what we considered to be false statements and claims. And I mean, there were places that we avoided also, but mostly we just decided that we have to be there and we have to communicate what we know and what we don't know, because some of those that say the wrong things are very certain about the science they think that they are supporting or building on. So the answer is that's not really an issue. It's just an issue how can you do it and how can you do it in the best and most effective ways.
Then we have one more over here.
Hi, I'm Charlie Yoon from Korea. Thank you very much for your presentation. All the respect on your success and career. In order to success globally, then probably you emphasize the communication and communicating with the truth. I guess if you come to some other countries, then probably it will be extremely hard. The way I see in, not to speak in United States, but in Korea, I guess make this some other parties and other people and even the government, and there is some gap between them among ourselves, and sometimes fake news and all others were overwhelming over truth, and probably that's not happening in some other countries because of those gaps. And you should come to one of the Asian countries and work with us, and probably. How would you say that if some other countries are, well, even if you have independent institute, then probably that will be very hard, even if they try very hard, as what you said. Do you have any suggestions and comments?
It's a very good question. I'm sure I don't have the full answer to that, but as I told you, first of all, it's not perfect in Norway, but as I told you, the way of communicating was very different during the pandemic in 2009, 2010. So over the course of those 10 years from that pandemic, so it sort of ended until the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, there were many changes, and they were stepwise, and it wasn't entirely clear that it couldn't go backwards also. So it was a risky thing to do. But I think you have to look for opportunities. You have to look for organizations, contexts where you can raise the issues publicly, but also people to work with who will understand how important this is for doing the job they're doing in right ways. So slowly, slowly. And I think the principles are the same, but the conditions are very, very different in different countries. So you have to adjust to that in order to move forward and not just risk your life for your job.
Then we have a question from the chat.
Yeah.
I'll read it out loud. And it is from Vanessa Fuller. And she says, many thanks for sharing your experiences. I'd like to know if there's some sort of training that you or Norwegian public health institutions provide to their researchers, experts on how to engage with the public and communicate their science more effectively. What is the most important what is the most important component to your mind to such training? And second, what can we as editors of science do to help in communicating science more effectively?
Very, very good questions. I think I cannot answer for the Institute of Public Health, but do contact them directly. They're very good people and very good at this. And if she sends me an email, I'll send her the contact information to the right people, not only the institutions. So that's the first thing. I don't know whether there is systematic training now, but there is training of people who want to be or are a lot in media, and support for those who are, regardless of what their opinions might be. So yes, there is some training, but not systematic and comprehensive. The other question is, what is the most important? Well, you have to look for opportunities for explaining why this is important and showing it. I don't think one should sort of just run up on the barricades. You have to make people, to work with people. So the most important is to respect other people, I think.
So again, it's about trust.
Yes.
Well, thanks on behalf of Vanessa Fuller.
Yeah.
And then we have one last short question from the audience because we're running out of time. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Ines Steffens, editor of Eurosurveillance, published by ECDC. So quite well aware of what happened during the pandemic. And I know the WHO had devised some general principles for crisis communication built on trust, openness, and that was way before the COVID pandemic happened, even though this wasn't always applied. I continuously think, reflecting on the differences within Europe and beyond, is there a principle and a general concept of trust that we can apply throughout different cultures? Because you may have to consider cultural context. So what worked in Norway and what worked in Sweden, which was slightly differently, as we all know, and it had both its advantages, and there was both trust in a large part of the population, whereas in other places this wouldn't have worked. So I'm always thinking, is there how do we, and what can we do as editors, for example, in an international publication using English as the lingua franca? How can we consider these cultural contexts so that we apply the messages to as many people, the important scientific messages to as many people as possible?
Well, I agree with you. You have to consider the cultural context, and you have to be patient, and you have to find out where you are and how to work in a good way where you are. So I'm not saying that these principles should be applied globally immediately. I'm just saying, telling a story about how we slowly work towards that kind of communication and that kind of use of science. And I think that you, as editors, can do a lot. I think that science really needs to be communicated to all for many reasons. One is to create trust, but the other is to create engagement in science as something that is important for us in society. And none of this is done overnight. I mean, we're speaking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and all depending on historical developments. And we know that it can change very rapidly. We've seen it, we see it unfold today. So it may go backwards also. So I'm not sort of a missionary on these issues, having the solution, but I do know what the goals are. And I think also the WHO did a great job on communicating during the pandemic, but they were in a very difficult position many times and under an enormous pressure. But trust, yes, trust is important. And I think the kind of, to be, our best preparedness for anything is to have well-functioning societies with a welfare state and democracies. So I mean, and that's not something that happens overnight at all. But one has to deal with thinking about how that can be developed and how important it is also during major crises.
Thank you very much. We have a whole range of questions in queue, so you certainly managed to engage the audience. Thank you very much for that, and thanks for a very inspiring and interesting morning for everyone. I'm quite sure I can see that on all the faces. We will move on, and I'm sure that the panelists of the next session will feel very excited and inspired after this, giving you another exciting session. And this one is led by the man who is approaching the lectern right now, namely Brian Cody.